Okay. Hi everyone. So I hope you had a good weekend. Um, if you haven't done the experiment yet, make sure you do that before watching this lecture. So it'll be up on Canvas. So just check that out. And once you're done with that, then you can go ahead and watch this lecture. Okay. So this week we're going to be talking about false memories. So some questions I want you to think about while you're watching this, while you're writing your lab report, really any time is good. Can you trust your memories? It's an open question for you. How about when you're confident? So when you remember something, you remember a conversation, and you're certain it happened a particular way, or you're really sure that someone said something to you, is that meaningful? Or does confidence not actually really predict accuracy of memories? That's all stuff we're going to talk about today. Also, when are our memories wrong? Um, what causes these mistakes? And of course, the big one that kind of extends from all this, can we trust eyewitnesses? Okay, so before we jump into our specific experiment, as well as some other famous experiments on this topic, let's just talk a bit about false memories in general and why they're so important. So what are some, just think for a second, what are some consequences of having false memories? How can they, be a problem in society and day-to-day life, in any situation, really? Well, the biggest one is, of course, going to be eyewitnesses. So a lot of the time, we do actually need, um, you know, an eyewitness or several eyewitnesses to get a conviction. Sometimes you can use DNA evidence or other factors, but a lot of times it does actually come down to eyewitnesses. So we're of course going to talk about how that can be, a problem. People, eyewitnesses falsely recognizing someone who could commit any sort of crime. That's of course a big consequence and a reason to study false memory. But even beyond that, how about just social situations, right, or conversations? You've probably had lots of times where maybe you were had an argument with a friend and they or you falsely remember someone saying something that they didn't actually say. Maybe they kind of falsely remember your specific words. Maybe they falsely remember you calling them stupid versus you said something totally different, or called someone else stupid, whatever it might be. Um, Maybe you walk up to someone you've actually never met before and greet them. Um, Falsely recognize them. That could be another situation. So, bottom line is, there's a lot of situations where um, false memories can be a real problem. Sometimes it just leads to kind of a funny conversation, but other times it can, of course, lead to more serious consequences, especially again with eyewitnesses, but also just with social situations. Okay, um, so let's talk a bit about our specific experiment. So we kind of know obviously why false memories are so important, why we need to research them. Um, so let's talk a bit about how we actually do research them, specifically what we did. So we did a classic experiment from the 90s. It's called the DRM paradigm. DRM just stands for the names of the authors, Deese, Rodinger, and McDermott. Um, and paradigm just means that it's just a laboratory technique. So it's a really great study. It works like 99% of the time. Um, it usually works even if people know what it's about and have done it before. Even if you warn them about it, they typically still show false memories. It's also just really nice and easy to conduct, which is of course very useful. So, anyways, like I said, this is called the DRM paradigm. So, what you do is you study um, related words, semantically related words. So, semantically just means meaning based. So, words that are all relevant to each other based on their meaning, right? So study a list of words or several lists of words. We'll get to that that are related to one. For example, you study bed, rest, snooze, nap, and night. These words are all, of course, related to one word, which is sleep, right? However, you never actually study sleep. All the words in each list are going to be related to one central word that you're never actually going to study. Yet, probably about 80% of you remember studying the word sleep, and it never actually appeared. If you don't believe me, go back, check the experiment again. You'll see that you never actually studied sleep. So we do this for several different lists. So you study one list that's all the words are related to the word sleep, but again, sleep never actually appears. You do this for foot, window, and several others as well. So each list is going to relate to a single word that was never actually presented. Just a few more details on the procedure. So you study all these words related to sleep, you recall as many as you can, and then you repeat this 7 more times. So you study a different list each time, of course, of words related to one single word, and then you take a test. You do that 8 times in total, each for a different word. Okay. And after every list, you of course try to recall as many words as you can. So you just write down as many words as you can remember. In that test, that recall test, people will typically write down those related words like sleep, foot, or window, whatever it might be, that you never actually studied. That's the recall test. There's also a recognition test, which is a different one. We're just going to look at the recognition data for our experiment, but if you'll like it, feel free to look at your recall test as well. So once you've done this for all 8 lists, you do just a brief distraction. So, this is just to kind of get anything to get your mind off what you were learning about and kind of create a bit of interference in memory. That's not really super important. And then we move on to the recognition test. This is where we present you with words, several different kinds of words, and you have to decide whether you studied each one or not. Okay? That's the recognition test. We'll break down each of the conditions in just a second. So, in the recognition test, items are divided into 4 categories. So there's 4 conditions within subjects. Each person is going to be exposed to all 4 word types, and this is the independent variable, which is of course, word type. And it's divided into 4 levels, being presented items or presented word, whatever you want to call it, critical items, weakly related items, and unrelated items. And I'll give you an example in just a second. An example of each of these in just a second. Okay, so again, 4 conditions being the 4 different word types you're going to see in the recognition test. That's our manipulation going to happen within subjects. Okay. So just again, as an example, if you studied a list like bed, rest, wake, snooze, blanket, etc., these are what the 4 recognition test items would look like. So the first one is going to be called presented. These are words that you did actually study. So obviously, you did see bed here. You're going to be presented with that later as an item you did actually study. And you should, of course, say, yes, I did study this item. You did study it. Another one, kind of the main one of interest, is what we call critical items or critical lures or critical words, whichever you prefer. These are going to be the items that you never actually studied, but that each list is going to be related to. Okay, so again, if you studied all these words related to sleep, you never actually studied sleep, but they're all related to sleep, that's the critical lure. And that's the one we're going to expect you to falsely recognize a very high chunk of the time. and we'll talk about why in just a bit here. But that's kind of our main hypothesis, is that you're going to falsely recognize the critical items that the lists were related to. Okay. We also have what's called weakly related items. So these are going to be things kind of similar to critical items, only they're, as the name would suggest, weakly related to each list. So if you studied bed, rest, wake, snooze, and blanket, drowsy would be what we call a weakly related item. What this means is that it is related to a list you studied, but only weakly so. It's not as strongly related to the list as, say, the critical word like sleep. Okay, because drowsy is kind of more loosely connected to sleep. Just if you're curious, how they actually, I think how they actually make these lists is they give, not the people are doing the experiment, but they give like a research assistant a word like sleep, and they say, okay, think of as many related words as you can. And they start out by saying bed, rest, wake, snooze. So you're given sleep, you start thinking of these words. And the words that they tend to think of later on, like drowsy, they define those as weakly related. So the logic there is that if it's kind of, if it's not, if when you're given sleep, if it takes you a while to think of drowsy in response to that, it's because drowsy is weakly related to sleep, right? It is related, but only weakly so. And then, sorry, and the stuff that isn't weakly related, they kind of put that in the presented category for stuff you study, you should recognize. Lastly, we have unrelated items. So these are going to be words that you never studied. Or sorry, I should clarify. So critical items, weakly related and unrelated, you never studied any of those. Presented is the only ones you actually studied. But these ones are all never studied, but they're different in terms of their relation to the lists. So unrelated items are, again, things you never studied, but they also, as the name would suggest, are not related to any of the lists. So bandit obviously doesn't, doesn't relate to the words in this list, doesn't relate to sleep or anything like that. Okay, so before we go on to what you typically find in this experiment, let's talk a bit about the rationale for it. So in general, with our memories, there's really just, the bottom line is that there's too much interference, there's too much going on in our day-to-day lives to remember everything, right? So, remembering what you did at school today or conversation with a friend, you can't remember all the details. That's just not how our minds work, right? We can't remember every single word that someone might have said to us. We can't remember every single encounter we had throughout the day. We just can't access all that information. But we of course have a way of overcoming that. We kind of have a way around that that's pretty clever. And that way is that we tend to get the overall meaning of a situation, counter, or in this case, a list of words. So you probably heard many times before, our memories, of course, do not act like cameras. We tend to encode only the most important parts of an encounter. So if you had a conversation with a friend, again, you're not going to remember every single word they said or the exact phrasing of everything they said, but you will remember the overall meaning of the conversation. Similarly, let's say you went to a lecture, you're not going to remember every single word that was said, but you will hopefully remember the overall meaning of the lecture, kind of the most important parts and what the take-home message was. So how do we remember when we do need to remember specific details? How do we do that? Well, we tend to actually reconstruct it rather than actually remember it. So we're going to look at a bunch of examples of this, including our own experiment that we did. But that's kind of the general rule, I wouldn't say rule, but general mechanism by which a lot of false meanings tend to arise. So we remember the overall meaning and we fill in the blanks with various sources of information. So on to our specific study. Let's look at that in terms of this hypothesis. So if we're saying that we tend to remember the overall meaning, what are we going to remember from a list that's all related to the word sleep? We're going to remember sleep, right? We're going to remember the overall meaning, which was sleep, right? We're not going to remember the overall meaning of stuff that's unrelated to that list. And let's look at our results. Or sorry, not our results, but what you typically find in this experiment. So remember, presented items, this is stuff that you did actually study. So not surprisingly, people do pretty often recognize the words that they did study, like bed. But the interesting part is what happens with these critical lures. So these items that you never actually studied, like sleep, but that everything was related to. Again, if we're relying on the overall meaning of a list of words related to sleep, well, we're probably going to remember sleep, right? We're going to kind of infer or construct that. I think there's some debate over that. The general finding is that you're kind of making more of an unconscious, we'll talk about that later, assumption that the word sleep was studied, right? Because it's so closely related to all the stuff you did study, right? To just think of that, in a real world context, if you studied a whole bunch of words related to, the word TV, or and then someone asked you, well, did you study remote, or did you encounter the word remote? You probably did, right? It's kind of a reasonable assumption that a lot of the time is going to be accurate, but not in this situation because we're kind of exposing that inference process, or inferential process rather. So again, if we're building on this idea that we remember the overall meaning of a situation or a series of stimuli or a list or whatever it might be, that would predict that we're going to remember words related to the overall meaning, like we see here. But what about stuff that's to a lesser degree related to that? Well, we should, of course, remember it to a lesser degree, or recognize it to a lesser degree. So that's exactly what happens with weakly related items. Remember, weakly related items were words like drowsy, where it relates to the list, but less so compared to the critical words. Again, something like drowsy is to a lesser degree related to all the words you studied. So therefore, we're going to be less likely to recognize it. However, something that's weakly related to that overall meaning should still be recognized more often than something that is totally unrelated to that overall meaning. So that's where you see the unrelated word. So again, I think the example we gave was bandit. It started with a B. Bandit doesn't relate to the overall meaning at all, so it of course should be rarely, if at all, recognized. And that's exactly what you find. So in short, this DRM study is kind of meant to expose how we rely on an overall meaning. We tend to infer things that, based on that meaning, that maybe never happened or were never encountered. Let's look at some other examples. But before we do that, there's kind of two overarching ways in which we reconstruct our memory. So again, memory is not reproductive, it's reconstructive. We tend to remember what's important and kind of make assumptions about the rest. So you remember a lot of things related to sleep, kind of make an implicit, unconscious assumption that sleep was studied. At least that's one argument. But anyways, so kind of two mechanisms by which we reconstruct things are schemas as well as new information. So schemas just mean kind of our general concepts about an event, or rather our general concept about anything. So what do we think of, what do we typically expect to see in a certain situation or a certain environment? I'll give you plenty of examples in just a minute. The other one is, of course, new information, like say how a question is worded or any evidence presented to you after an event happens. Okay. So let's start with the first one. How can schemas impact our memory and lead to false memories? Well, um, a big one is, or a big kind of finding in this area is this classic study by Brewer and Trian, um, known as the office study. So looking at this question of how schemas can influence our memory, what they had people do was wait in an office, and I think they didn't tell them it was part of the experiment. So they just said, okay, you're doing a psych experiment, wait in this office, we'll be with you in just a minute. Okay. In that office, you find they, of course, left stuff that you would typically find in an office: desk, chairs, a typewriter, because it was like 40 years ago, and other stuff. What they actually did was is then they said, "Okay, we're ready for you now." They took him into the next room and and said, "Okay, actually, what we want you to do is we want you to recall everything from the room you were just in, from the office you were just in. So write down as many things as you remember from the office you were just in." So what you typically find here is that, not so surprisingly, people do remember stuff that was actually in the office. They remember the desk, they remember maybe chairs, typewriter, stuff like that. However, because memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive, they also remember stuff that you would not typically, or sorry, you would typically see in an office, but was not in that particular office. So they also remember stuff like books, pens, whatever else, phone maybe, or I think this one actually, but bottom line is they remember stuff that you typically see in an office, but was not in that particular office. And one other thing to mention is they'll often do this with pretty high confidence, especially in this study, I think they did, and especially in the DRM study. Um, so when you see these critical errors, not only do you recognize them, but you're very confident that you studied. So to kind of go back to what we talked about earlier, um, even when you're very confident in a memory, it can still be inaccurate. So why are they thinking they study? There were books and pens in an office they were just in that were not actually there. Well, because that's what you would typically see in an office, right? Our schema, our concept of what you typically see in an office is influencing their memories. Again, they remember the overall meaning. They remember maybe a few particular items, but they generally remember I was in an office. And then they're reconstructing the rest based on, well, what do you typically see in an office, right? Using their schemas to reconstruct their memory. Um, and of course, you could probably imagine how this could be problematic for something like um, eyewitnesses, which we'll get to later. So maybe someone accuses someone based on their schema of a criminal. They maybe have a stereotype of what criminal criminal typically looks like, and they use that to inform memories rather than actually remembering a suspect. So we'll get to that. So a few more examples in terms of this kind of idea of schemas and reconstructive memories. Another great study by Chan and McDermott. They had people read sentences like "baby stayed awake all night." So just think for a second, how would you remember this sentence? Well, you probably remember the overall meaning, but what do babies typically do based on your schema? Why might a baby stay awake all night? And what might it be doing while it's staying awake? It's probably going to be crying, right? Um, and that's what people tend to remember. So when you ask them about the sentences later, say, "What was the baby crying?" They'll often also remember that it was crying, or that they read about it crying. Again, because of their schema. It's kind of a reasonable assumption that if the baby stayed awake all night, it's because it was crying, or that it was crying while it stayed awake all night, even though that was never actually um, part of the sentence. So our schemas remember the overall meaning about a baby staying awake, and then we reconstruct the rest based on a reasonable assumption. Just another thing I want to highlight, though, is that this is not often not a conscious strategy. So it's not so much the case that we think out loud and say, well, the baby was awake all, kind of like I just did there. You don't really think out loud and say, well, the baby was awake all night. It probably doing something. It was probably crying. You do this without even knowing it. So same with these other experiments, like the office study. You're not necessarily. It's possible you might, but most of the time you're not going to consciously think of, you know, well, what do I typically see in an office? I'm going to guess those. You probably have actually a very hard time distinguishing between what you're inferring and what you're actually inferring. So it's kind of, that's what I mean when I say it's an unconscious process to some. Again, we remember the overall meaning, just we fill in the blanks. Okay, what about this other issue? So we've talked a bit about how schemas can influence our memories, false memories. What about other sources of information, like new information or maybe how a question is worded? Well, that's another big topic that people study a lot with regard to false memories. How can the wording of a question impact our memories? So that's obviously, like I said, all these things are big topics, but I'll give you some of the classic studies. This was one from the 70s that kind of kickstarted a lot of false memory research, I think. Loftus and Palmer had people watch a car accident, right? So two cars or a car and a truck, whatever it was, getting in an accident. And then they asked people questions about it. So they asked maybe, was there broken glass? And also, how fast were they going when the accident occurred? However, there's one thing that they manipulate. They manipulate how the question is written. So they do this between subjects, and they ask different questions that lead to actually different memories for the event. So again, people are, I just want to emphasize, people are watching the same video, the same crash or accident. But when you ask them about it later, that's the manipulation. You phrase the question differently depending on what group they're in. So in one group, you ask them, how fast were the cars going when they crashed into each other? In the other condition, the other group of subjects, you've asked them, how fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other? All that's changing here is a single word. So one group is asking the same question but crashed. One you're asking bumped. I think it was as opposed to. I think they've done other versions where they said hit. Doesn't really matter. Anyways, this simple change in this one word actually changes their estimates of speed and damage. So when you say crashed, they think the cars were going faster than if you were to say bumped into each other. Furthermore, when you ask them was there any glass when the cars either crashed in one condition, or you say when the cars bumped into each other in the other condition, again, same video, you're just changing the wording of the question after it's occurred. They're more likely to think that there was broken glass if you said crashed compared to if you said bumped. Pretty crazy, right? So what's actually going on here, though? Well, this is again an illustration of how the way you word a question can also be used by people to reconstruct their memories. So the word crashed, of course, is going to imply a more violent collision. I think crashing into each other. The other one, bumped, implies a less violent collision, right? Just bumped into each other, maybe a fender bender, right? But they're actually picking up on that on probably on a more unconscious level. You're going to use that word to construct their memory of the event. So when you say crash, they're going to reconstruct a more violent collision, and they think the cars are going faster and there was broken glass. When you say bumped, it implies a less violent collision, and they think, oh, they weren't going that fast, and also there was no glass. Again, a single word being manipulated can change people's memory for the event. So like I said, that's another way we construct things based on how questions are presented or any new information. Just because this seems a little pessimistic, I wanted to actually present something that very briefly that you'll find interesting, I hope, and is also kind of positive aspect of this whole gist based memory idea. So there are people, you can read about this in your 453 textbook, but there are people who can actually remember things in great detail. So people with these kind of super memories. These people don't really. So you ask these people something like, "What did you have for lunch 10 years ago on August 29th or whatever?" They remember it in like perfect detail. And I don't know how they verified that, but I'm sure they did somehow. These people have incredible memories. So when you ask them, you know, to do certain tasks, namely encoding or namely kind of focusing on the overall meaning of something, they actually struggle with it. So if you ask them to say read a passage or read a story and say what were the most important parts, they have trouble with it. And the reason some people have argued they have trouble with it is because they don't really think that way. They don't think in terms of, okay, I can't remember it. Sorry, I don't want to phrase it like people doing this consciously necessarily, but again, on a more, at least on a more unconscious level, people do kind of think what's most important because that's what I'm going to try to remember because I'm not going to be able to remember it. People with super memories don't have that problem. They don't need to focus on the overall gist because they can remember everything. But that actually does come at a cost because they're so unused to needing to focus on the most important parts or the overall meaning. Just this can actually lead them to, or make it hard for them to extract what's most important. Like I said, when you ask them, well, what was the most important part of that story? They say, I don't know, because they're kind of used to just not needing to do that. So that's kind of one, I guess you could say, adaptive function or adaptive ability we have, but it can be associated with false memory, of course. Okay, a couple more examples of how kind of new information or any kind of information can also lead to false reconstruction. So another famous study by Wade et al. They showed people doctored photos, edited photos, um, about childhood things. So, for example, um, and some of them were real, whereas some of them were made up. Obviously, like I said, doctored. So, for example, they might get a photograph from the parents of a subject participant and edit that photo into something that never actually happened. So they might check with the parents, say, did your child ever take a hot air balloon ride as a kid? And they'd say no. Then they would edit a photo to make it look like they did actually take such a ride as a kid. Okay, so basically, bottom line is they're creating these photos of things that never happened as a kid. Initially, or sorry, um, what you do is, or what Wade et al. Did was they showed people these doctored photos. Some of them were not doctored as control, but we'll mainly focus on the ones that were doctored. So again, showing events that never actually happened, like say, person taking a hot air balloon ride. When they presented people with these photos, initially, then they asked them, "Do you remember this happening? Do you remember taking a hot air balloon ride uh, with your father on your birthday or whatever it might have been?" Initially, they don't actually remember that, and just pay attention to that because that'll become relevant later. Initially, you ask them, "Do you remember this?" They say, "No, I don't really remember. I don't think I ever took a hot air balloon ride." So you typically give them some time, maybe a few days. You say, "Well, try and remember it. See if it comes back to you." You ask them later on, "Do you remember taking this hot air balloon ride?" First of all, they do remember it, and they remember it typically with a lot of detail and confidence. So there's your false memory. But what's also even more interesting is that they'll fabricate details for an event that never happened. So you show them this photo, you say, "Don't you remember taking this hot air balloon ride with your father?" With a bit of time, they won't just remember that event, but they'll even invent details. They'll say stuff like, "Oh yeah, I remember I had a burger that day," or um, "had a bad birthday cake," or "I remember standing in line for a long time before getting on the hot air balloon." So they're again confabulating details for an event that never happened based on information you're presenting them. And this is kind of the second part of what we're talking about. Using new information or information presented to you to reconstruct your memories. So when someone presents you with evidence, like a photo of you doing something, with some time, you're going to say, going to reconstruct a memory of that whole event that never even happened. Pretty wild, right? So you could probably imagine where this looks pretty grim for eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses can be wrong in a number of different ways. Like the ones we talked about, schemas and inferences can, of course, play a big role here. So, they might build an image of a suspect based on what they think a suspect looks like, or some stereotype they have of a criminal, whatever that might be. Just kind of thinking about, say, the Loftus study, car crash versus car bump. But leading questions can be a big issue too. So kind of, go in there and tell them, well, what was he wearing when he stole the jewel? It really implies that the person did it and is guilty, rather than asking them a more neutral question like, say, do you recognize this person, or was this the person that did the crime? How you word the question can also lead to that filling blanks there. So again, seems pretty dismal for getting convictions, right? Can we possibly trust, based on what we've talked about so far, all this false memory, how easy it seems to develop false memories? Is there really any point at which you can trust eyewitnesses? Think about that for a second. Just a couple other things. There's other issues that can arise with eyewitnesses. One is known as the own race bias. So this is the finding that people are typically better at facial recognition of people of their own race. So a Caucasian person is typically going to be better at recognizing Caucasian faces, and an African American person is going to be better at recognizing African American faces most of the time. I think there's a couple different theories about this one, but a big one is just the idea that it relates to time spent with your own race. So if you grow up, in your family, and you're naturally going to spend more, or it could be different demographics or whatever it is. You're probably going to be spending more time with people of your own, looking at people of your own race than people of other races. And the idea is that this basically just develops almost kind of just gives you practice in being able to recognize those faces. So because you're going to, maybe just through family, and maybe for other reasons, spend more time around your own race, you're basically getting more practice in recognizing faces of your own race. Just if you're interested, that's actually not super well supported though, despite it making logical sense. They've looked at, the correlation between how much time do you spend with certain races, and does that predict the own race bias? And they found there's like a really small correlation there. So there's probably other reasons too. Anyways, just also if you're curious, it does work with age. People tend to be better at recognizing faces of their own age for the same reason, but it's inconsistent with gender. So you're probably not better at recognizing faces from your own gender versus the other gender. Okay. I think the last one talk about that can be a problem for eyewitnesses is something known as weapon focus. So this is pretty self-explanatory. What it sounds like. If someone comes up to you, threatens you with a knife, threatens you with a gun, how much time are you going to be spending looking at their face versus how much time are you going to be spending the weapon? Well, probably you're going to focus a lot more on the weapon. This is just kind of an illustration of what that looks like. Can you really pay attention to someone's face at all when they're threatening you with a gun and that can, of course, make it hard to recognize the person later on because you weren't hardly even looking at the face, but instead looking at the weapon. Okay, or sorry, one last one. There's the Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton story. So this was a number of years ago. Basically what happened was Jennifer Thompson wrongly accused Ronald Cotton of committing a crime against her. He went to jail for a while, but was eventually exonerated because some new evidence showed up showing he couldn't have done it. Furthermore, according to Hugh, 2013, eyewitness misidentifications played a role in the majority of more than 300 convictions that have been overturned because of DNA evidence since 19. So a lot of false convictions happen because of eyewitnesses. But one last, or where we talk about maybe when eyewitnesses can be trusted, is this true when they're confident? So let's say someone walks in, an eyewitness walks in, and they're really unsure. They kind of admit they're just guessing. Does that matter? Is that just as accurate as someone who walks in and says, I'm like 100% sure this was the person? Does that actually mean, does confidence actually predict accuracy when it comes to eyewitnesses? Well, for a while, people have argued that, well, actually, people still argue this, that confidence is a very weak predictor of accuracy. It's like next to nothing. So you being confident means nothing in an eyewitness context. That kind of fits with what we've talked about earlier a little bit about how, say, in the DRM study, people will wrongly recognize a word like sleep that they never studied, and they do so with high confidence. And many other studies too have looked at confidence, that people can definitely show false memories and be very confident. So from that perspective, it's not too surprising that that confidence doesn't seem to predict accuracy with regard to eyewitnesses. However, that might not be the full story. So eyewitnesses certainly can lead to false convictions. Eyewitnesses certainly can be wrong. However, just over the last several years, kind of since I started graduate school, actually, there's been some evidence coming up that eyewitnesses that are confident might actually be reliable. And the main finding is that basically the confidence does predict accuracy with regard to eyewitnesses under the right circumstances. Now, just to be clear, that's not to say that eyewitnesses are always going to be right. The question here is, does their confidence predict their accuracy? So someone might walk in and say, I have no idea, I don't recognize any of these people. We're not, Wickstead et al. Are not arguing that doesn't happen, but just that if they are inaccurate, they don't know who to choose, their confidence is going to reflect. Right? So just to be clear about that. We're not saying people don't focus on the weapon or whatever else might happen, leading to them not knowing who to choose. But again, the question here is, does confidence capture that? Okay, so before we look at that, let's just take a step back and think about confidence in kind of more, we'll call them, standard memory experiments. Does confidence predict accuracy? In what we'll call standard, recognition memory. So recognition memory, we've kind of touched on this before, but this is just a basic procedure used to test memory where you study words, and then you're tested on words studied and words you didn't study. So that's what we mean by new and old words. You study 50 words, you might say get 100 words. Later on, 50 of them you studied, 50 of them you didn't study, and you have to decide for each one whether you studied it. That's the test. Sometimes along with this decision about whether you studied each item or not, you might ask people to make confidence judgment. So, how certain are you in your choice? Are you sure this was studied? Are you sure this was unstudied? Are you only moderately confident that's studied or unstudied? Whatever it might be. There's a lot of different ways you can do that, but the bottom line is, they're going to make some sort of confidence judgment about their decision. Do you think confidence predicts accuracy in this situation? Yes, it most certainly does. It can be impacted by other factors, but generally there's pretty high calibration or correlation between confidence and accuracy in these kind of just simple recognition experiments. But that might make you wonder, right? So why is confidence, in a kind of simple recognition, word recognition or face recognition, whatever it might be, why is confidence predicting accuracy there, not predicting it in an eyewitness situation? An eyewitness situation, if you think about it, really is, a lot like a recognition test, isn't it? You're hopefully studying someone while they commit a crime, and then later on you see them in the lineup. You have to decide, did I see this person? There could be other details, but on a basic level, isn't an eyewitness situation a recognition test? So why, if that's the case, why is confidence accuracy in kind of this simple recognition not predicting it in an eyewitness situation? Well, we'll come back to that. But let's look at the big factor here. Going back to Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Todd. Initially, when they asked her to pick someone, she took 5 whole minutes to pick someone. She looked at the faces, thought about it for a whole 5 minutes before deciding it was Ronald Todd. When they asked her, how confident are you? She said something like, I think this is the guy. And the officer said, you think this is the guy? She said, it's him. She asked, did I do well? The officer said, you did great. And later on, she said, I'm certain it's him. What do you notice about her confidence here? And just to clarify, keep in mind that she shouldn't be confident, right? Because she's picking the wrong person, she's guessing, so she shouldn't show any confidence. Well, initially she's not, right? Initially she's taken 5 minutes to choose someone. She says, I think this is the guy. It's only with time that she's becoming more and more confident, and also with some feedback, right? Officer kind of encouraging her based on her decision. So that's kind of a big factor here. And also, just as a different note, remember back to the balloon study. Initially, people don't have the false memory. Initially, they say, no, I don't remember taking a balloon ride. With time, they start to, yeah, I remember that. They maybe have a lot of confidence that it happened. They invent all these false details, so on and so forth. But initially, they're doing a good job. Well, it turns out that might be a very critical factor in whether eyewitness confidence predicts accuracy. Again, back to this recognition idea, what's going on there? It's initial confidence, right? It's not, they make a decision, they get some feedback, they have some time to think it over, reinforce it in their brain. They get that one initial confidence rating. Well, initial confidence for each decision they make. That's why I brought it up, is because in standard recognition, you are dealing with that initial confidence. So if we take the initial confidence of an eyewitness, is it going to predict accuracy? Well, it turns out that it very much might. Just another side note, I won't go into this too much, but another thing that's been found is that the way you actually measure confidence can have an impact as well. So if you ask people to give a rating from 1 to 6, it's not as good as making a rating from 0 to 100 for some sort of percentage based. So saying, 1, I'm not sure at all, to 6, I'm certain, is not as good as saying, oh, I'm 20% sure, I'm 80% sure, I'm 50% sure. I'm not entirely sure why this is, and I don't know of any research on this. Actually, something I wouldn't mind researching, but my only guess would be that it's maybe the 0 to 100 is more intuitive somehow, like 5 to 6. 5 seems like a lot, but then you think about it, it's actually only like just over 80% of the 6 point scale. So I don't know, maybe it's just somehow less intuitive for people, or there's not a range enough of a range. I'm not really sure. Anyways, but bottom line is that the 0 to 100 is better in terms of calibrating confidence, or in terms of the correlation between confidence and accuracy. So using that method and using initial confidence, let's look at the actual correlation. Remember, it was non-existent, basically non-existent, when using non-initial confidence. This is what it's like when you use initial confidence, or at least some people have argued. So notice here, there's a very strong correlation. So when they say, oh, I'm like, 18% sure, they're right about 21% of the time. When they, say, oh, I'm like 47% sure, they're right about 48%. When they say, 76% of the time, they're, or 76% sure, they're right about, whatever that is, 75%. Bottom line is there's a very strong, remarkably strong, I would say, maybe even so strong that it seems a little suspect, correlation between confidence and accuracy when you take that initial confidence, and also when you use this particular scale. Just let me know if you want to read this paper. I can send it to you or just post it up on Canvas. There's a few other factors. So like we said, first time confidence is a really important one. No feedback kind of goes with the first time issue. So again, with Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson, when she made a decision, then the officer said, yeah, you did a great job. That's really gonna make her more confident than she actually is. Another big one is not letting the suspect stand out. So this is kind of I mean, it seems obvious, but I don't know that's, maybe that's just in hindsight. If you have, say, all the suspects look very similar, that really helps confidence predict accuracy, and I would presume just improves accuracy overall. I'm not sure about that. So for example, if the suspect is like only female in a lineup of males, or the only male in a lineup of females, the only tall person, the only blonde person, any kind of distinction like that is really gonna mess things up. So I would presume that the logic there is just that, um, if there's all these people that don't look anything like the suspect, then there's this one person that looks kind of like the suspect, they're gonna pick that person. Whereas when you deal with people that all look very similar, they kind of, are only gonna pick the right person with confidence, if they really do remember what they look like, because they're no longer, it kind of takes away them just recognizing someone similar because all the people look similar. Um, so yeah, if those criteria are met, then we end up with something like this. At least some people have argued. As you could probably imagine, it's a very hotly contested topic. Some people have pushed back pretty hard. There's kind of new papers on that pretty often. It's a really interesting. It's not really my field, but of course, I'm still interested to hear it. And there's other factors too. So it's a promising idea though, for sure. But like I said, people are pretty reluctant to accept it. And I don't blame them. So just something I'd like you kind of think about. We can't really have discussions because we're online, obviously, but do you buy this idea? Do you think that highly confident eyewitnesses can be trusted, if these circumstances are met? Or is it just kind of a lost cause? Maybe these circumstances are just too rare. Maybe that's just like the planets aligning, and we should still just give up with eyewitnesses. It's a good question. That's certainly something people have argued. They said, well, yeah, in a perfect lab experiment, maybe you can make this happen, but in the real world, this is not going to happen. We're going to end up with a lot of false convictions. I don't know. It's a tough question, but it's a really interesting one. Anyways, that's it for today. Or sorry, one more thing. So just to summarize, remember that we recall the overall meaning, the gist of a situation or an encounter. We tend to reconstruct the rest. We use assumptions, schemas, question information, new evidence, say a doctored photo. And this can, of course, lead to false memories and lead to very confident false memories as well, which can be a problem for eyewitnesses. However, under the right circumstances, there is certainly evidence, tentative evidence, I would say, that confidence is a strong predictor and we can maybe use highly confident eyewitnesses. Okay, that's it for today. So let me know if you have any questions, and then next we'll be analyzing data. Bye-bye.